The UEFA Champions League is destroying national leagues. For those who participate, the tournament is a blessing. The financial reward can save the entire season. But the problem is that it creates a huge gap compared to those who don't compete in it. Luigi Di Servo, CEO of Serie A, said, "The Champions League creates an increasingly wide gap between elite teams and the rest, giving the qualified teams a structural advantage that is hard to counteract in their local leagues. And the truth is, there doesn't seem to be a clear way out. The basis of this phenomenon is that the European competition is a goldmine." The Champions League, through UEFA, distributes no less than 2.467 billion euros among the 36 participating clubs. When compared to what domestic leagues distribute, the only one that surpasses it is the English Premier League, with 3.22 billion euros. Far behind come Spain, Germany, Italy, and France. Not to mention the leagues below them: Portugal, Russia, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Turkey, which ranks 10th with only 74 million euros. Now, as you know, that international competition money is not distributed equally among the participants. The amount each club receives mainly depends on their results in the tournament and the economic importance it holds for the event. Specifically, the figure can range from 25 to 150 million euros. In the year 2024, the one who received the most was Real Madrid, obtaining 141 million. This was mainly because they won the event. Then followed Manchester City, PSG, Bayern, and Borussia Dortmund, completing the list of the top 5 earners. Although the key question in this video is not so much the specific number, but rather how relevant it is for the teams, mainly because we want to know if it indeed makes that big difference we mentioned at the beginning. In this sense, for the Spanish team, the Champions League prize accounted for 13% of the 1.045 billion it earned throughout the entire season. Other income streams, such as sponsors, the stadium, and the National League, represented a larger percentage. So, while it's not an insignificant percentage, it's not life or death either. Real Madrid will remain one of the 2 dominant forces in Spain, even without this money. Its position in the domestic league doesn't depend on that source of revenue. And if we look at other major powers, we reach the same conclusion. For City, the European competition accounted for 14% of total revenues, 15% for the French side, and 16% for the German club. So, up to this point, what we mentioned at the beginning doesn't clearly apply. However, if we look a bit further down, the situation is entirely different. Porto from Portugal, for instance, celebrated all year long for reaching the round of 16 in that edition. That meant 65 million euros for them, which helped increase their revenue from 109 to 174 million. That is to say, an increase of 60%. Over a third was thanks to the European tournament, greatly surpassing ticket sales, national television rights, and sponsors. Nothing beats a good performance in the Champions League. If we keep looking, we will find even more extreme cases. Bodo Glimt, which we mentioned in another video, made just 30 million euros in 2024, according to Forbes. They weren't playing in the big European competition then, but in 2025/26, they are, which will nearly double their revenue. Absolutely mad. Of course, that growth also makes day-to-day operations more complex. Going back to the Champions League, you might be thinking, I see no problem with all of this. These are smaller clubs located in less competitive countries that, thanks to this event, can make a leap in quality. That is completely valid. In fact, UEFA increasingly emphasizes that just participating already means a significant economic boost. Among other things, they seek to prevent such a high percentage of the prize from being concentrated in the final stages, which, as we know, are usually contested by the big teams. The problem arises when the competition ends and each team returns to their country. This is where a huge difference emerges, because obviously most did not compete for the big trophy. While the major nations have several spots, the rest only have one place in the league phase, or even have to settle for playing in the qualifying stages. Portugal, Belgium, Turkey, and the Czech Republic, for example, have only one direct ticket. For others like Scotland, Switzerland, Austria, and Norway, they get a ticket for the preliminary round of the playoffs. As a result, in these countries, the clubs that manage to qualify will be the only ones to enjoy that economic boost. The big problem with this is that the budget advantage later translates into a sporting advantage, which increases the likelihood of earning a European spot again the following year. It's a cycle that becomes harder and harder to break. To show you what we're talking about, let's travel to Scotland and analyze a specific case. There, according to UEFA, in 2024, top division clubs generated a total of 357 million euros. That means if we add up the income of all 12 teams, we reach that figure, making it the 11th most lucrative league in Europe, behind the Big Five and Russia, the Netherlands, Portugal, Belgium, and Turkey. That number indicates that, on average, each Scottish club generated 29.75 million euros. However, as the saying goes, most drown in averages. If you try to walk across a river that is, on average, 1 meter deep, it's very likely that midway it will be considerably deeper, and you won't be able to continue. What we mean regarding the league is that not all teams are around that figure. Some are above, and others are below. And certainly, there is one in particular that stands out above the rest in that country: Celtic Football Club. The Green Team generated no less than 137 million euros that season, a number clearly higher than the average of 29 million we just mentioned. In fact, it represented 38% of the league's total revenue. As you can surely guess, the team participated in the Champions League, which was a more than favorable advantage. Despite not making it past the group stage, they earned 36.5 million euros from the competition, accounting for over a quarter of their total revenue. To put that figure into perspective, the entire Scottish League generated only 34 million euros from broadcasting rights throughout the season. That is to say, a single team amassed more money in 6 matches, of which, in fact, they only won 1 than 12 teams did throughout the entire year in over 200 games. In other words, Celtic would rather keep playing in the Champions League than be the supreme leader of the national championship. Think about it. Sorry to insist on this, but the club earned 5.5 million euros for winning the league that year. It's not even a fifth of the European tournament. The real reward for establishing oneself in their country is the opportunity to participate in the international event afterwards. An unintended consequence of this is that it leads institutions to adopt unhealthy practices to qualify. Serie A's chief executive said, "This situation is leading many teams to invest beyond their means in an attempt to enter the new Champions League, causing a rise in costs that is hardly sustainable." In defense of UEFA, it is worth noting that both the Europa League and the Conference League do a good job of mitigating this difference. Rangers, the direct competitor of Celtic, earned 19.8 million euros, thanks to playing in the second continental tournament, and Aberdeen accumulated 4.9 million for the third. Even so, the conclusion is clear. Playing the top European event gives an overwhelming advantage over the others. The director of the Scottish national competition, Neil Doncaster, himself admitted the issue. There is a bit more competition in Scottish football than some believe, but there is no doubt that the money from the Champions League greatly distorts national leagues. I think this is the case across Europe, and it is a problem. At this point, we also have to admit that in all leagues, some will have more resources than others. It's impossible for it not to happen. The problem lies in how big the distance is between them, not just as a matter of fairness, but directly concerning the interest in the tournament. If there is no real competition between the teams, it's really hard for it to be appealing to the audience. If not, let's ask ourselves how much remains in the day-to-day of France's Ligue 1, a championship fully dominated by PSG for quite some time. Perhaps the best reference to measure this gap is the value of the squads that make up each national championship. If we look at Scotland, the reality is that the top 2 have a ridiculous advantage. While Celtic and Rangers exceed the 100 million euro mark, the 6 bottom teams do not even reach 10% of that figure. There's no way they can compete with them over a year. The result is obvious. The Green Ones have won 13 of the last 14 seasons, only losing the 2021 championship to Rangers. Now, let us compare that with the Premier League. There, we also find some clubs are stronger than others, but with more nuance. The most expensive squad, Arsenal's at 1.31 billion euros, is only 5.3 times larger than Burnley's, which sits at the bottom, not 34 times like in Scotland. More importantly, there's no free fall anywhere on the chart. Almost half the league has the tools to genuinely compete for the title. That is the true value for a national tournament, having competition and avoiding obvious matches where the gap is so large that it's not worth watching because the winner is already known. The big question is, how can we correct the structural advantage that the Champions League provides in certain countries? First of all, we must be clear that under no circumstances do the leagues want to lose those slots, even though there is that difference between their teams. Being there generates 2 very important things. On one hand, it grants enormous visibility. A large part of the world doesn't watch a single Celtic match, except for those played in the Champions League. Clearly, ENDF wouldn't have made a video about Bodo Glimt if they weren't participating in European competitions. On the other hand, it is also a great incentive for clubs to raise the bar in the pursuit of achieving that goal. Some people might go too far and then have problems, but that's better than having no intention at all. Now, regarding the gap, to lessen the impact, some could propose that those teams that participate should at least share a percentage with those who don't. Something that clearly won't happen, so we take it out of the possibilities. The one who does have some power to change things is UEFA itself. It ultimately determines how the funds are distributed. Of course, it needs various agreements with the clubs, but it can reach an overall solution. One option would be to reduce the minimum guaranteed payment for Champions League participation, those 25 or 30 million we mentioned earlier. This way, underperforming clubs that qualify through the national quota would see smaller rewards and less of an edge over their domestic rivals. The downside is that it would widen another gap between Europe's powerhouses and the rest of the continent. If everything leans towards results, the strongest will tend to take a larger share, thus increasing the disparity at the continental level. The last available option, which is indeed being carried out, is for UEFA to give money to teams not participating in its tournaments. Something quite counterintuitive. In one of its reports, the Union of European Football Associations made it clear, reducing financial gaps also reduces sports gaps and opens UEFA competitions to a maximum number of member associations and clubs. This is how the famous solidarity payments were born. Funds from continental events explicitly aimed at teams that did not participate in them. This reduces the pool to be distributed among those who did qualify. Specifically, in 2025 to 2026, the organization expected to allocate up to 10% of the 4.4 billion euros it earned through the three competitions. That represents a significant increase from the 175 million of 2024, clearly marking it as an issue to address. Denis Vujicic, Secretary General of the European Club Association, said, "In terms of numbers, I would say that in most countries, especially in the minor leagues, top division clubs will be very happy with the benefits they will enjoy from this new solidarity solution." Charlie Marshall, CEO of the European Club Football Organization, formerly ECA, also made it clear. The main goal and the reason there has been such a significant increase is to ensure that we are doing the best we can at the European level to maintain competitive balance within the national leagues. Now, does it really work? Is it enough to solve the issues? If we want to answer this, we need to do some calculations and understand how the money is distributed. The first thing UEFA did was limit the amount received by the Big Five. England, Spain, Germany, Italy, and France will each receive up to 10 million from this solidarity fund. From there, the figure decreases. According to data from 2024, the next country on the list was Denmark, with 7 million euros. Other leagues like Portugal, Austria, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Scotland also range between 5 and 7 million. Let's focus for a second on Scotland, so we can relate it to the data of Celtic, Rangers, and company. This country received 6.9 million euros through the Solidarity Fund, which, if we exclude the clubs that participated in European competitions, must be distributed among 9 clubs. This means that, on average, each will receive 768,000 euros, or, if you want to put it in millions, 0.77 million. And there's the problem. The number represents just 16% of what Aberdeen charged for the Conference League. 4%, that's what Rangers got for the Europa, and only 2% in Celtic's case, who played in the Champions League. How can we expect these funds to balance the scales? They are just a drop in the bucket. While the figure seemed promising at first, the final impact ends up being marginal. Maybe the problem is that it gets diluted among too many teams. If the league could concentrate it into 2 or 3 of them, betting that they compete with the top ones, it might have a more significant impact. Clearly, this is not an option. For the other 9 clubs to get the same as Aberdeen in the conference, UEFA should not distribute 6.9 million in Scotland, but 44 million, 6 times more. Unfortunately, if we extrapolate that calculation to the rest of Europe, the Solidarity Fund would need to be 2.2 billion euros instead of the 440 million we currently have. And that eventual number would already represent 50% of all the revenue collected by UEFA. In other words, half of the money would go to teams that do not participate in the events. This, even if UEFA were in favor, is also not an option. It would have a huge economic impact on those who actually compete for the Champions League trophy, leading to opposition from the big clubs. Let's remember that it is they who, at the end of the day, put on the show and allow UEFA to raise such a large amount of money in the first place. Therefore, the outlook is not very favorable. The small and medium leagues face a huge challenge. On one hand, the European spots are vital for their economic development. But, on the other hand, they create a superpower effect where 1 or 2 teams dominate for a long period of time, negatively affecting competitiveness. This leads to the local event positioning itself as a sort of warm-up for the Champions League. What do you think? What should the solution be? We read your comments, and don't forget to check if you are already subscribed to the channel. See you next time.